I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I am joined by a very special guest, a first timer for this podcast, Joan Oh man, I just asked you how to do it and I screwed it up. Joan Slonczewski.
Yes. Dr. S would be fine.
Dr. S, it is. Or just Joan. Joan is the author of a classic of eco-feminist science fiction called A Door to Ocean, which is the main book we're going to talk about today for reasons we'll get into. But I want to talk to Joan about her career in general, where she's from, so we can get a little baseline for everybody who might be new to her work. Joan, how did you get into science fiction, and what's your origin story with all this stuff?
Well, I grew up in New York, a very wooded area of New York, in Westchester, and I was always interested in science. My father, Joan Slonczewski, was next to Nobel nominated for his work on spintronics. He made things that are in everybody's handheld device for IBM. And so I was always interested in science, but I found biology more interesting, particularly the natural world around our house. And I started reading from a very early age. I read Heinlein and Le Guin, and was fascinated by the idea of other planets and other worlds. I was fascinated by the idea of the moon launch. And so those were of interest from an early age. And when I got to college, I was majoring in biology and chemistry, but I continued reading Anne McCaffrey and Heinlein, and I started thinking, I could actually write this stuff, especially Le Guin and Herbert's Dune. And so when I read Le Guin, I thought, well, I could write like this, especially the word for world is forest. I thought, well, I like that book, but I didn't like the ending. So I want to write my version of it, where the trees are on the ocean and there's a very different vibe. And I was also interested in living ecosystems. So when I read Dune, I thought, well, this is great, but where's the ecology? I want more of that. So I wrote A Door to Ocean in a way with the idea that, well, that was a dry planet. This is an ocean planet. And here's how I see an ecosystem.
What's really funny, too, is that I've written my book review of it, but I haven't published it yet. So it's going to seem like I referenced all these books because I interviewed you. But I mentioned the word for world is forest. I mentioned Le Guin. I mentioned Frank Herbert. I mentioned all these things. It really comes off on the page, the influences. You wear your influences on your sleeve in a way that I personally love. I like to see authors translate the stuff that they love into a new spin. And it's one of the things about the book that we're going to be talking about. It's just one of the things I really loved about it. But was A Door to Ocean your first novel, or was it? I thought it was your second,
right? My first novel that got a lot of attention. Okay, yeah. I had written another novel about a Quaker planet that was published and disappeared. But A Door to Ocean, actually, it took several publishers at the time that it was written. The idea of pacifism and nonviolence was completely out and was considered almost unpatriotic. That was at the time when our country was 10 minutes away from planetary ecocide. And so so it took a couple publishers, but Dave Hartwell took a chance on it, and it really worked out. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Betty Hall and Fred Pohl from being early supporters of my work, and it really clicked with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of my questions was going to be editors eventually, and some of my listeners, especially the ones that cross over to Dickheads, will know David Hartwell well, as he was Phil's last publisher editor as well. And so we talk about Hartwell quite a bit on the Dickheads, but as far as I knew, I had a feeling that this was number 2. But because we're going to dive into Door to Ocean a lot more, maybe we could talk about where you went from there, and then we'll circle back to Door to Ocean, because that's going to be the main focus of our discussion. What kind of books have you written since?
So I would especially mention, well, I did write The Daughter of Elysium, which was sort of a large multi-civilization book 1,000 years after Door into Ocean, and that had multiple cultures and was more of a, here's a complicated world that looks like our complicated world today, and dealt with issues like emigration and gender issues and technology issues. What kind of molecular technology could enable people to live forever, which is what the Elysians do. Then in the year 2000, I published Brain Plague. So Brain Plague was really ahead of its time. Brain Plague was about people who had a brain full of intelligent microbes in their heads. And they communicated with the microbes and with each other by something like the internet. But if you recall, on 9/11, the internet barely existed. Okay, people recall where you were at,
especially to the way we think of it now. Yeah,
the way we think of it now, it did not exist, where like everybody has it, and you're always going around with your phone. So my world was like that. Everybody has internet plugged into your head, but at the same time, there are these communities of microbes in your head that are negotiating with you. And so that world is really where we're at today. I mean, today you hear about the human microbiome is involved, a part of the brain, and is causing and curing brain diseases. So Brain Plague is really where we're at today. And of course, the internet. So I think when people go back and read Brain Plague today, you can say, well, that's where we're at now, but I had it in the year 2000. So a quarter century ago. So I've also just recently turned in a sequel to Brain Plague called The Qubit Plague, which is more about AI and where we're going with intelligent machines. So
awesome.
Those are the kind of things I'm writing about today.
Right. And so one of the things that is awesome about the way that you write this is that you bring your training like into this. And so could you tell people like what what you do as a scientist, because I think that that's really important as well to this story.
So as a scientist, I study bacteria. I look at bacterial drug resistance. I investigate the molecules that put bacteria together and enable bacteria to communicate and to grow in environments and to communicate with the brain. For instance, one of my research areas is looking at how bacteria in your gut produce neurotransmitters. Okay, so people don't realize that most of the neurotransmitter molecules, such as glutamate and serotonin, are actually made by microbes, specifically by your gut microbes, which then transmit them up the vagus nerve into the brain. So I look at the molecular biology of how that happens.
Right. And so one of the things that's really cool about the book of yours that I've read is that you can tell you've got a scientific mind, right? And that you're thinking these things through. Some of us have to just like pretend when we're writing science fiction that we understand these things, and it's cool that bring such a better understanding to them. So let me give you my backstory on how I ended up reading A Door into Ocean. Yes, I'm a big science fiction guy. I'm a huge, like, lifelong science fiction reader and all that. In the year 2000, or it was 99, 2000 ish, when we had, like, kind of the prototypical or early internet. I was working at an anarchist bookstore in my hometown in Indiana, and one of the most popular books that we sold there and talked a lot about was Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And we had a habit of saying there, because we would always, like, some of us that worked at that bookstore would always push The Dispossessed and Le Guin's Always Coming Home. And we had a little thing on the shelf that said The Dispossessed is Anarchism 101 and Always Coming Home is an advanced class. And then we always talked about it as, like, kind of eco-feminist, da 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 da. And one of our regulars came in after she had read both The Dispossessed and Always Coming Home and said, I need more stuff like this. And we were really, at the time, like, I'm a lifelong science fiction reader. I could recommend like 10 books to her, but I didn't have anything for her for eco-feminist. So I did an early Google search and said, I'm looking for eco-feminist science fiction. And the two books that came up screaming at me were Starhawk's Fifth Sacred Thing and A Door into Ocean. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to read both these and see if I can recommend them. And so my first time reading A Door into Ocean was in 2000 for this prompt, right? And I remember at the time just being like, oh, this is, and I remember thinking like, oh, it's like Dune, but on an ocean world. It's very similar to Dune. I remember I kept comparing it. The way I referred to it when I eventually promoted it to this customer was I said, it's an eco-feminist Dune on an ocean. And I don't mean to be reductive about it because I was trying to, sell the book. And I know that she read it, and that everyone at the store, like, we at the time, it became a book that we ended up putting on the shelf next to The Dispossessed as one, like, hey, if you like that, here's another one that you can read. So shoot ahead to earlier this year. I'm speaking at the Queens of the Future conference because I'm doing a workshop on DC Fontana, who was writer for Star Trek. And the organizers said, hey, would you want to be on this panel about A Door into Ocean? And then I was like, and I admit I had not thought about that book in a long time. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I have to reread it. But yes, I want to talk about it because I instantly thought about, like, how we always talked about it in the store. So that's to say that I have had many conversations about this book before because we talked a lot about it at the store. And I just wanted to give you that background on that because I think it's a neat way to have discovered your book, because I consider it one of the first Google searches I did for a book.
David, well, that's great to hear.
Yeah. So tell me the history of how this book started. Like where was, you've already kind of given me the first kernel of the idea, right? You wanted to do something that was similar to Dune with the world building. How early were and I should say from here on out that we're gonna talk about the book as if you've read it. So if I haven't done my job to sell it to you, people can go pause this, go by, read the book, come back and join us. But I want to talk freely about the book. So tell me about developing the story. Did you outline it first? Like, what was the process in starting this?
Well, David, that's a good question. So I started the book while I was in graduate school working on bacterial motility. So perhaps the idea of my ideas come from all different places. So since I was studying bacterial motility, perhaps the idea of people swimming all the time came from that, right? But at the time, I was also working with the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, on action against nuclear war. And I helped, in fact, I helped run the big demonstration in Manhattan where we got 1 million people into Manhattan for the nuclear freeze. I was part of organizing that.
Well
So
done.
I saw up close how the Quakers organized nonviolent action. And I want to emphasize, while the book depicts an all-female society who use nonviolence to thwart an interstellar invasion. So while it depicts an all-female population, it's not just about females. So the ideas of the techniques of nonviolence and revolution came largely from my reading of Gene Sharp, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And Gene Sharp was the mastermind for things like the Arab Spring and other revolutions. That's since Gandhi, Sharp is really the last word on nonviolent revolution. And even just this past year, in Bangladesh, you had a regime overthrown by largely people power without weapons. So at the time, though, this was something that nobody else was writing about. So when you say I was looking at other models, it's important to also know what was unique about my book. And really nobody else was doing nonviolent action that succeeds. Okay. That was just nowhere else. In fact, when my book came out in 1986, it drew extra attention because that's when the Soviet republics had largely broken free by nonviolent action. And people wondered, well, who else is writing about this? I originally actually wanted to write about Poland breaking free nonviolently, but I thought nobody would believe it because it was so unpatriotic to write about nonviolent action. But I was aware of Poland and the solidarity movement through my father, who had relatives in Poland. When my book came out, it achieved notice for that unique depiction. In fact, Isaac Asimov cited my book as one of his favorite books of the year because nobody else was writing about peace revolution.
Oh wow,
So,
that's a pretty cool feather in your cap right there.
yes, exactly.
Well, and I should say, like, the only time I've ever like seen a protest movement really depicted in science fiction before this was maybe Ron Goulart's Flux, but at that time that book is mostly humor and it's not about nonviolence. It's specifically about, kids that blow themselves up in the protest. So it's very different. In what's funny, because I read Flux again. I read Flux for the first time this year, so I specifically and I knew that I was going to be rereading your book when I read Flux, but I hadn't gotten back to it. So I was thinking of them synergistically a little bit. But one of the funny things about what you're doing when writing about nonviolence is that, for a lot of times, a lot of science fiction books get sold on the action adventure and those things. And one of the things about the last 100 pages of A Door into Ocean is it really cooks in the last 100 pages, but it's entirely on the nonviolence, and it's great. It's as somebody who's done a lot of protesting in their life and doing that, I appreciated that about it. So, do you feel like the scientific parts or the protest parts were equal in your inspiration to do this, or did one kind of start spinning the other a little bit faster, if that makes sense?
Everything worked together.
Yeah.
In terms of the politics and the science were synergistic, and that was true throughout. In fact, I published. I actually put a study guide out on my website to explain this for teachers who want to teach the book. Explaining where the science comes in and how this works. So there are two things that are important to know. First is that I read intensively from Gandhi and Sharp. And Sharp's encyclopedia and 3-volume treatise of nonviolence depicts many actual historical events where nonviolence worked. And so when I developed those incidents in my book, every one of those incidents was based on something in that really happened in history. Okay. So like there were nonviolent resistance acts against the Nazis, which was considered impossible, but that did occur. You know, there were people who got their relatives freed from the Nazis by nonviolent protest. Those things were documented and occurred. And so I depicted plot elements where similar things happen in my book. And I showed the mechanisms of it. So Gene Sharp treats nonviolence as a science. He says, well, here's what happened historically, and here's the mechanism. Here's the mechanism of psychology that shows why it happened and how it works. So I saw that as much a part of science as the biology in my book. So
social science is still science fiction, right? Social science. I mean, you know.
Right, but social science does incorporate elements of reproducibility and prediction in explaining and interpreting what happens in the world. And so I tried to do that the way Sharp did. The other thing is I developed a broader science framework for understanding how nonviolent works related to other aspects of physical science, which was the idea of subject-object interchangeability. So even the language, one of the unusual things that no one else has done that I did in my book was develop a language that interchanges subject and object. So for every statement you make about a subject and object, it has to work the other way. So that's why the sharers cannot obey their overlords, because anything they say, if we obey you, you're obeying us. It's the same way. It's the same phrase. And this is shown in the book as being related to physics, because in physics, people don't realize that much of physics is taught in a militaristic way, objects colliding and hitting other objects. But in fact, in physics, forces are always interacting on each other. Okay, so if a moon orbits a planet, the planet orbits a moon. They actually orbit a space between the planet and the moon. If you hit something with a hammer, then the substrate hits the hammer back. So even in physics, there is this subject-object duality. And so I developed that through the language of the sharers to show that ruler and hegemony relations among people also have this duality, that you can never rule a people unless they accept that rule. It's actually not possible. So I use those physics analogies to explain how nonviolence works.
So, and I'm wondering how much did you develop the sharer culture before you developed kind of the plot of the story, or was it all at the same? Did you kind of develop it all together at once? Because it feels to me like that there's a way you could do this where you'd be like, okay, this is how the planet works. This is how their culture works. Now I'm gonna try to develop a story, or, I mean, there's various ways to do this for writers,
Well, in my writing, the development goes on together. So I had very early the concept of the sharers that was inspired by the Quakers that I worked with. And at the same time, I had my laboratory where I experienced all these amazing things in real life science, particularly molecular science. For instance, in my first year of graduate school, I worked next door to a lab studying purple bacteria with a purple pigment that bleaches white upon illumination. So it's like a switch. When it absorbs the light, then it bleaches. And my fellow students were really excited about it. Somebody pulled me over and said, look, you have to see this. This bacterial molecule is a light switch. So I looked at that purple switch and I thought, suppose this were the bacteria in your skin, and suppose it were oxygen instead of light. You would have oxygen breathing bacteria that provide oxygen for the swimming sharer.
Mhm.
And that was at the same time I was figuring out what the sharers looked like. They would have adaptations for swimming in the ocean. And also that they, I tried to think, what clothes would they wear? Well, they probably wouldn't wear clothes. They would just be purple, and they would have this option of bleaching white in order to breathe longer in the ocean. So it's like all the time in my head, I'm experiencing science ideas and ideas from the Quakers and ideas from my own family. Some of the characters are related to people I know in my own family.
Right. And so now the sharers, so one of the things about this, and if I interpreted this wrong, you let me know, but this is a far future story. So this is descendants of ours, like, and the idea is that humans have gone out, there have been various eras, millions of years, and humans live in all kinds of different worlds, and these particular humans have um, been there so long that they've evolved to this world to a
Yes.
degree, and much like that's very similar to how Dune is set up, and so and we'll get into like some nitty gritty details about like the culture of this future, because things that I thought were interesting. But the sharers live. One of the first things that I want to talk about is, and I should say too, before we get too much further, is one of the ideas of doing this interview and this talk is that, for one, I just read the book, so it's all fresh in my head. And two, like we have about a month and a half before we'll be on stage together at a conference talking about this. And I wanted another chance for people in Southern California and my listeners that are here, like, hey, you can be a part of this conference, you can go to this, and this is one of the fun, cool things you could do, is have these kinds of discussions. So there's that. But I want to start with the rafts, the idea of the rafts, because it took me a little while, like, and like one of the funny things about like science fiction like this is that I had a friend once describe to me that when you read a really weird piece of science fiction, fantasy, or like surreal fiction, it can feel like your brain is kind of separating from your body and you're like I kind of get this, or it takes me a little while to get this. And I think some people don't like reading this kind of science fiction because, like, for me, if I don't get it right away, it's okay. I'll flow with it and maybe it'll make sense to me later. And one of the things, I'm fine with that. I like reading science fiction where I'm like, okay, maybe this will make sense in a bit. But one of the things that I really liked about this book is this idea of the rafts, the communities that, they become like these floating towns where like the sharers gather, and they're kind of like an archipelago of like homes that are on the ocean. And I got that right away. I thought, if I'm misinterpreting that, that it's such a neat concept. But one of the funny things about it is, because when you're so ahead of the curve, it really made me think of Avatar: Way of Water, which actually I am a fan of. I really I actually liked it. But and one of the funny things about when you're doing this long enough is you realize, like, sometimes the zeitgeist just gets similar things going. And I really love the idea of the rafts being like this, how their homes interface with the ocean. Can you tell me about developing that? It's such a
Yes, so
great
I did a
concept.
lot of research in ecology to develop the raft trees. And I was at the time, I was very interested in how the ecosystem could survive, how our planet's system could survive. And one of the things that I did a lot of reading on was the mangrove forests. So there are many places on our planet where particularly in South America, where you have mangrove forests that actually extend the land. And so these are trees that extend their roots down into the water. So I took an extension from that. I thought, well, suppose the roots simply extend into the water and don't ever need to be rooted. I mean, there is a thing called hydroponic gardening. So in my research, I looked for things that really exist, okay, and took these different pieces of things that really exist to put it together. And then I later read about the existence of actual floating rafts. In fact, so I posited from the mangrove forests that there could be trees that would actually be flat, where instead of the trunk growing up, it would grow radially in branches, and then roots could extend into the water and draw nutrients from the water. It seemed to me there was no reason that could not exist. Then later I learned that actually there are floating raft ecosystems that are spun off from rivers, such as the Amazon River and rivers in toward the Galapagos, where you have whole chunks of land that float off and can have antelope and capybaras and things on them, and can actually end up with floating ecosystems that transmit animals to other places. So the idea of a floating ecosystem is not so far-fetched.
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering how much did you think out the founding of this colony, right? So there's humans somewhere in between where this novel takes place and where we are now that find this ocean world and say like, hey, we're gonna go here, and this is a primarily female culture, and they use uh I have the parthenogenesis, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, to reproduce. So
Actually, they don't use parthenogenesis. That's a good suggestion, but what they do is what they use is biotech. So they use biotechnology to modify the proteins of one egg and allow it to fertilize another egg. So it's actually allowing one egg to fertilize another. And this was way ahead of its time, because at the time this was thought to not be possible. But my understanding of molecular biology led me to believe that it could be possible. And so today we know enough about the molecules to see how such a thing could be possible. So the difference is that parthenogenesis involves only the chromosomes from one parent, whereas egg fusion would involve two parents.
Yeah. Well, and as a feminist male who's married to a pretty radical feminist, I see why the sharers would want to have their own world, right? And to have a world where they could be on their own and not have to deal with my half of the species.
Well,
And
that's true, but remember that the main viewpoint character of the book is a young male who
sure.
visits and becomes a part of their society. So this was very important to me. The gender words did not exist. Remember, this was 1986. The gender words did not exist to describe what the sharers are. Today, we have a much broader range of gender words. I would say they are pansexual. Okay, they're not so much feminist as pansexual. They happen to be female in their genitalia, but they can incorporate male members. It's just that they don't define attraction based on polarity of sex. Okay,
Right.
so someone who's pansexual can be attracted to either sex, and that is how they're portrayed. And I realized decades later that that's what I had shown, right? I know there were literary scholars who commented on this and how it was possible for a male visitor to become a part of the pansexual culture.
Right. So, but and getting back to the founding of this culture, like I like that it's kind of at least it seemed to me, I might have missed it, but it seems like it's a bit of a mystery of like how it all started. But I'm sure you've thought this out, right? Like
Yeah,
how
so I thought out, and I mentioned at different points that now I know that readers don't like 600 years of intergalactic history. right?
Right.
So I did not actually, I tried to be as light on the backstory as possible to avoid dragging the main story. But I do have this clear vision, which is referred to occasionally. There's one starship captain in the book uh, who who runs the ship between the two moons, and he has lived for many generations because of time dilation. And so he comments on how there used to be multiple planets. Most of them killed each other off with nuclear wars. And so just a few survived.
Yeah,
And of
and I
those,
definitely quoted this scene in my review. And yes, and so one of the interesting things too is that the kind of dominant paradigm empire is called the patriarch. You know, and but the war that kind of created this conflict is referred to as the brother wars. And so definitely some thought, and I don't take offense to this personally as a feminist, but there's definitely some thought to the gender that maybe had a role in kind of causing this conflict. And which
well,
is
at that time, David, remember at that time,
sure,
uh, the world was basically run by men, right? I mean,
absolutely.
you know, when I was one of the first female scientists, one of the first female professors at Kenyon, where I teach now, and the people in power, you did not have lots of, even today, you don't have many female senators and leaders. We have more today than at that time. But at that time, basically, who was running things. So I think in that context, that
Absolutely. And it makes perfect sense. And actually it's a point I appreciate and agree with. I found it. It's page 49. And he says, I believe he's talking to Spinel. And he says, "You see, I was just a starling like you in my home world, burnt to a cinder in the brother wars. After that, why I just wanted to get as far away as time and space allowed. So I took the Tauran route and ran it for centuries, period, until they oh wait, that was me because I was dictating it. Until they retired me to this hole, the brother wars before the patriarch, and he's referred to as a prime. Yeah, so yeah, it's all there. And um the kind of roots of it, and so you kind of get the idea that the sharers like were kind of um escaping that whole part of civilization. They were trying to do their own
yes.
thing.
So one thing I should point out is the idea of common descent or phylogeny. One thing that really bothers me in science fiction is when you go out and find aliens out there and then you immediately have sex with them, right?
Yeah,
So like, how is that possible? Because they would have evolved on a different planet and have completely different chromosomes. That always bothers me. So in this book, I really emphasize that all of the human appearing people, in fact, share common ancestry. And that's important because the whole point of Merwin, the main sharer, bringing Spinel, the boy, to the sharer moon is to show that, well, yes, he shares descent with us, he's human. And there's a play on the word human. So people are always asking, well, is the other side human? Because if they're not human, we can just kill them, right? And that's something we all say. Well, if our enemy isn't really human, if they're inhuman, we can just kill them. Whereas if we recognize their humanity, we can't kill them. So there's a dual play there. Is humanity a matter of how we act, or is it a matter of our descent? Okay. And some of the characters are saying, well, these are just animals, whoever the enemy is, they're just animals. And other times they're saying, well, we share a common humanity. So one of the things I did in research for this book is I looked up human shared descent with our near human relatives, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, and the bonobos. And to my view, the, the, the chimpanzees and the bonobos and gorillas they're virtually human. They might as well be human. So how long ago did they diverge? And I asked myself, would it be realistic to have divergence among such different kinds of entity, whether you call them animal or human? Would they still be possible to interbreed? In fact, the chromosomes, our chromosomes and the chimpanzee chromosomes are similar enough that we could interbreed. And we are more similar than various cat species, such as lions and tigers, that can interbreed. So in principle, we are close enough to interbreed. And I looked at the amount of years. It's believed to be like several million years since we diverged from the other apes. And so that it seemed to me reasonable that a shorter amount of time you could have for a group such as the sharers to evolve and to be distinct. And also they engineer themselves, so they accelerated their own evolution.
Right.
I was
Well,
also
and I think it's really cool and smart way that you're doing like that kind of colonial idea is that all these people that end up on other worlds, they have to evolve to these planets. Otherwise, you know, like we specifically are designed by nature to live on this planet, right? So if we're going to survive on another world, we're going to have to accept somewhat of the evolution. Otherwise, I mean, I guess some of the patriarch might be shaping their worlds to fit them, but and over time maybe we'll have the ability to do that. But it's a really interesting part of the world building of this book, and one of the things that obviously I love about this book is the world building. It is great, it's fantastic. I as a fan of great world building, it's also done pretty subtly and effectively. So big fan of that. And one of the things that I think is neat is how subtle too, and I pointed this out in my review. Because when you start reading this book, it's easy, especially on the sharers parts, when you're from the sharer's point of view or you're um on in their world, like it could easily feel like a fantasy novel, right? Because it's so different. And then you get these little moments with Spinel that show you that, you know, where he's talking about servos and like the mechanical parts. And there's one part where she's talking about the Sky Street of Centerway and Iridium and the hang cars. And so you get the science fiction aspects, but they're so subtle and they're done so well. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
About the book. It's one of the things that's really ace about the early parts. So so one of the things that's great is if we didn't have time to live with the way the sharers live and didn't get to experience part of what they were doing, the nonviolent resistance in the last like 200 pages wouldn't feel as powerful. So the way the book is divided is really like I kind of feel like the book kind of unintentionally has like 100-page chunks, right? And which works out because it's 400 pages in the hardcover edition. So so one of the things that's nice about is your first 100 pages kind of introduce you to the sharer's world. You kind of meet Spinel in the second 100. You meet the patriarch in the 300s, and then in the 200s to 300s, and then in the last you get the nonviolent resistance. And whether it was intentional or not, that's kind of how it works out. And I think it's really great because if you're not into the world building, like which I am, so it wasn't a slog for me, but some people like don't feel as propulsed by that stuff. The propulsion of the novel really kicks in once the patriarch shows up and really starts wanting to change things. So that said, I think people, if you don't like world building, you've got to stick with it. Because it really, now, like I said, I didn't have a problem with it because I like that stuff. And I think most science fiction readers are there for it. So, but the once you get into the conflict, it just really cooks. So tell me about developing that conflict, because there's a way to do it where it can come off kind of cheesy, and then you have like there's like kind of the white savior narrative that we've seen a bazillion times in fiction, where you have a technological culture and a less technological culture, and there's a lot of ways you avoid that stuff very
Listen, it's
smartly.
definitely not a white savior narrative.
Absolutely no.
If anything, it goes against that, because there, there is a boy from the Valadon culture, the patriarchal culture, who's picked up by the sharers, but they basically, it's like they rescue him like a stray, and then it's all the other sharers that have to figure things out to rescue themselves. The other thing I would point out, um, there is a color dimension. Few people have noted that in Adored Ocean, there's a conscious color dimension. So it's really tricky writing about race, and I knew that, and I didn't want to tie the book to current racial ethnicities, but at the same time I wanted to deal with it. So you have the color of the sharers is determined by their microbiome, and it is switchable. Okay, so they can be purple, and then they can turn white when they get stressed, and it's by the switching of their microbes. So that was to introduce a color dimension, to deal with the aspects of color in how people view each other, without without taking from our current society. And it was also intended that, Alice Walker's The Color Purple. So that was intended as a reference to say that, well, these are people of color. And when Spinell goes to Shura, he starts out as a kind of olive color. So when the purple microbes bloom in his skin, then he turns black and is described as black. But that happens, by the time you get to the middle of the book. So that was intentional. Okay, so it is clear that the people of color are rescuing themselves by their own technology.
Yeah.
Okay, and the sharers are described throughout as having their own technology. So they have their own technology, which is different from the Valen technology.
Right. And I wasn't trying to imply that. I was implying that you avoided a lot of those things in very many smart ways, but by having but you were able to do the clash of culture
yes,
in a different way, in a way that was very, very smart, and
the other thing I tried to do was to show that, despite the fact that the Valen's culture was invasive, despite that, there were aspects of the Valen culture that were useful for the sharers and vice versa. So there are certain characters in the book who managed to code switch and to make that connection.
Yeah.
And that I think that's something, in order to have a successful nonviolent revolution, you have to recognize that of the human in the other, and that is very genuine. You not only recognize it, but you find good things about that culture, despite the fact that they're invading you.
Well, and one thing that's really interesting, especially with the fact that, one of the things that was interesting about when I was invited to be on this panel about a door into ocean, that it's funny because of the way that we discovered the book, that my group of friends and I that read it, I honestly didn't know that anyone else had read the book, right? To be honest, I didn't know that there was like a reaction that people considered it a classic or all those things, because we thought we discovered this rare gem, and we thought we were so cool. We found this book that, oh, we found an
eco-feminist. Well, you are
eco-feminist.
cool, David.
Yeah, well, I know, but it's still like, it was really interesting to me, because when when the email came, it's like, it's it's a thing of like looking at it and being like, oh, cool, that there's a wider reaction to it. So one of the things I'm wondering is all these things that we're talking about with the world building and all these things, like, how did it translate as the author, like when you got it out in the world, like how is it different seeing the reaction to, because usually I'm interviewing authors that have brand new books out, because I'm either studying authors that are long dead or I'm interviewing authors who have brand new books out. So looking back on this book now with the hindsight of time, um, are you really, how was the reaction to the book different than you expected? Or were there things that people got that you were like, oh, I'm not even sure I was seeing it there? Because it looks like you had this very thought out, right? Was there anything that was a big surprise that people took from it?
I think actually the main surprise to me was how how effectively people got it. That people from such a wide range of backgrounds really did get it, because I felt that during the time when I was writing this book, that the surrounding American society was so brainwashed into thinking a certain way about, about the other, those.
These books is, one of the, reasons why the conversation across generations is one of the things that's so neat about science fiction. I just did an article about the Games Machine trilogy that A.E. Van Vogt, Philip K. Dick, and Barry Malzberg did, where they basically wrote versions of the same novel over 3 decades, and it becomes like this conversation, and I think one of the things that's cool is that when we leave these books, whether it's, take for example Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, which is one of the first major books to really talk about gender issues, and trans issues and things like that in a way at a time before it was really possible to talk openly about it. And novels like, one of the things that's cool about A Door to Ocean is it becomes a novel that can really, you're saying, it was much harder back then to, you know, for women in a lot of situations. Like, we've made a lot of progress. And one of the cool things about this novel is that it's a feminist statement from a time when it was much more needed. Not that we don't need it now, but, you know, um, I love that about this novel. So, and then,
Oh, there's a funny story related to that. So at that time, um, where did what was the germ, what was the conception of the idea of the sharers? So actually, it goes back to I, the first book I published, which I was basically just learning to write. It was about a Quaker planet, but I just happened to include one gay character in the book, just one very minor character. So after that book was published by Del Rey, the only fans I heard about, there was no internet back then and books just disappeared. So other than Quakers, the only fans I heard from were gay people. So, and people started coming out to me, like all my friends who I didn't know were gay. They said, oh, you had one gay character in your book. Wasn't that wonderful? Because back then it was so rare to find that. So after my first book disappeared, I thought, well, oh, and then I found out that gay people had gay bookstores. Okay.
right,
So I thought, well, the way to make sure my books stay in print is if I write about same-sex content, because then it will be in gay bookstores. So that was another reason why the sharers were developed, why I developed that. I thought, well, this is what I need to do to avoid my books disappearing. So I think that gay and lesbian bookstores had an enormously important impact during that period of the 80s and 90s.
mm-hmm. Well, and I guess, and I don't want to, I mean, this book, you know, um, it's been around for a while now. So one of the things that's interesting, and it's cool that um, we're going to be talking about it coming up here in Los Angeles. But you know, there's such value for, I had an aunt say to me one time, my mom's twin sister was having this whole conversation with me about when they made the decision to, when they were talking about going or not going to college, in the early 60s, and how like different of a conversation it was than I could, as a modern person. Like it was like, oh, I didn't, she was talking about, how they were really just expected to be secretaries, and, that growing up in the little town in Minnesota that they were in, that no one like took them seriously is going to college and these things. And it was like so interesting to me because it was such a different time. And so one of these things about this novel is that I hope that younger feminist science fiction authors, readers, stuff like that, that they will get a sense for the world that this book was written in and what it means, just like all science fiction. Like, one of my big activist projects right now is the C.L. Moore project. I'm trying to get Catherine Lucille Moore. In the 30s, she grew up in my home state of Indiana, and the building that she worked in, as the bank, is now a Hilton hotel, and the mail slot where she sent all of her stories to Weird Tales is still in the lobby, and I want to put a plaque there. And I think what it meant for her to be writing science fiction in the 1930s, and being who she was, is something that needs to be remembered and thought about. I think that, yeah.
So today there are so many women scientists. I mean, you look at the Nobel Prize for CRISPR gene editing by Jennifer Doudna, and I was privileged to be conducting research in a very closely related field and to see the kind of work that she did in the journals. And I do mentor many young women scientists today. And so I think that we should be looking forward and try to do more of that.
Yeah. And and I look at this book, right? And there's this young woman on the cover here that wrote this book at a very different time. And I think it's one of the things that we're supposed to be honoring about this thing and this work, whether whoever it is. Like, the conversation of science fiction is one of the things that makes our genre different than all the other genres, because I don't think romance writers like go back and say, like, let's look at the history of where this all came from. I don't know, maybe they do, but for me, honoring the tradition of where we came from is one of the things that I do this podcast for, and do all the writing about the history of science fiction. And I'm really honored to be able to talk to you today about this novel, which I think is a masterwork of eco-feminist science fiction, and that it really makes a statement about the time in which it was written. And so, like, my ears perked up when you said, well, you have to understand how much different it was, when we were writing it. And I love that. That's what we read the old stuff for, because it's a time capsule where people in our past were thinking about the future, and it gives us a chance to do that. What do you think? And I'm going to be sensitive about your time here. What do you think is the most important thing that A Door into Ocean can say about today, as a novel that you wrote at that time, as a person now living in 2024? What do you think it says about today?
I think the most important thing A Door to Ocean says about the world today is to have hope that we can save this planet, that there can be a future, that if we care about our ecosystem the way the sharers care about theirs, and if we're willing to fight for it and put our own lives on the line in a peaceful way, but consistent with science, that we can do it. To have hope. Well, that's what young people most need today about our planet, is hope. And I hope that's the most important message from my books.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So on that note, Joan, how can people find you and your work these days? Do you want them to find you? I don't know.
Yes, I'm always happy to hear from fans, and I have my own website. Just if you Google my name, my website comes up. My own website of science fiction and science research. All my books are available from Amazon as well, and from the standard ways to get books. So that's about it. But I always love hearing from fans. Always happy to reply.
Well, and I'm excited to celebrate this book with you in person in Los Angeles, and excited to hear what the other panelists have to say. Um,
I'm hoping to hear from screenwriters, by the way. I started to write a screenplay at one time for A Door to Ocean, and I'd love to pick that up again at the media conference.
Absolutely. It's funny. Hollywood always wants to cross. It's this meets that, right? And what a pitch! Like, Way of Water meets Dune. Come on, like two of the most successful movies ever made. So, like, come on, Hollywood. Let's do it. So, on that note, we'll see folks in Los Angeles, and please, yeah, and there's all kind. The schedule is up online for it's the speculative fiction across media. So, as
And
then
I will be there not just for the panel on A Door to Ocean, but also I'll be working with a panel led by Kate Johnston on women and science in Avatar and Black Panther. So
that's awesome.
come see Kate's panel as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. There's so many things on the schedule I'm looking forward to. And I will be doing a talk on DC Fontana. So
hey, I'll look into it.
Yeah, I published as an article in Foundation that can I tell you a story? It's my theory that she is a wider impact on 20th century science fiction than she's given credit for, not just for Star Trek, but for storytelling in general. So I have a lot to say on Dorothy, and I had the honor of interviewing David Gerald for that article, and she was the godmother of his children, and he said some amazing things. So people can look forward to that because I have pretty cool slideshow planned. I dug through the memos at the Roddenberry papers in UCLA, and her memos are so great. Of just her, like, she was also the person who really told NBC off every time they tried to do, like, she was great, and those memos just made me like her even more. So there's a lot to hear out there. So I hope people will check that out too at the conference. If not, my article's in the Foundation. It's issue.
Okay.
Oh shit, 147. So since we were just talking about it, but anyways, Joan, this was awesome. Your book is great. I'm going to read the other stuff eventually. It was an honor to talk to you about this book. I'm so glad I read it again, and we will talk to folks later. The next episode of this podcast will be a breakdown of the unproduced Alien 3 script by David Toohey is the topic. And then after that will be Huddling Place by Clifford Samack from the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. So we have good stuff coming up, and we'll talk soon. Thanks for listening, people.
Thank you. Thanks so much.